Aliens scanned the human Battlefleet. What they discovered left them frozen in fear. The scan took 0.3 seconds longer than it should have. I noted it, filed it, moved on. That was my first mistake. My name is Veth Kars. I am the Senior Intelligence Analyst aboard the Dominion Warfleet vessel Undying Certainty. 19 years in this role. 37 pre-engagement assessments completed, each one accurate, each one the last word before the fleet made its decision. I know what raw military data looks like when a species is strong. I know what it looks like when a species is pretending to be strong. I know the difference between a genuine threat and a number that looks alarming until you account for context. In 37 assessments, I had issued 8 genuine threat designations. The Dominion acted on all 37. The results were, without exception, exactly what I had predicted. The numbers had never been wrong. They would not be wrong now. That was not optimism. That was 19 years of professional record speaking. I settled into my station on the intelligence deck of the Undying Certainty and looked at the alert that had come through at low priority. Low priority because the tactical officers had already performed the basic arithmetic and found nothing alarming in it. 61 human vessels, appearing at the edge of Dominion-claimed space, dropping out of faster-than-light travel in a tight cluster at the system's outer boundary, not advancing, not transmitting, just arriving and holding position. Our formation numbered 412 vessels. The arithmetic was not complicated. I began the scan. The Dominion scan array reads hull composition, crew biometrics, weapons charge states, engine output levels, and structural integrity data simultaneously across distances of up to 40 light minutes. It returns a complete dataset in exactly the time physics requires. The calculation is precise. It accounts for signal travel distance, local space density, and environmental interference. It is not approximate. It does not estimate. It does not round. In 19 years, I had never seen it take a fraction of a second more than its calculated return time. The result should have returned in 1.7 seconds. It returned in 2 seconds. I looked at the delay counter, 0.3 seconds. In 19 years, that had never happened, not once. I opened a maintenance log, entered a note about calibration review, flagged it as low priority, and turned to the data. 61 human vessels. The first pass flagged nearly every hull age indicator as probable sensor error. The system does this automatically when a reading exceeds the statistically expected range. It assumes, as I do, that impossible numbers mean instrument failure rather than accurate results. I ordered a second pass. The second pass agreed with the first. These ships were old. Not old in the way a vessel becomes when operational demands push its service life past the intended end and the military decides to squeeze more use from it before retirement. Old in a more fundamental way, the kind of old that settles into material itself. Hull plates carrying stress patterns from decades of pressure cycling. Drive cores with maintenance records so extensive they had become their own documents. The scan was reading ships that had seen things, which is not a useful analytical category, but it was the only one that fit. The fleet's average hull age across 61 vessels was 93 years. Some were considerably older. My scan technician, Drenola, looked up from his secondary console and told me that the human fleet's tactical formation was non-standard. Loose, he called it. The vessels were spread wider than any doctrine in our database recommended for a force of their size. Not chaotically wide, not dangerously wide, informally wide, as if they had arranged themselves by long habit rather than by any specific directive. As if this formation was what 61 ships looked like after they had been together long enough to find a comfortable distance from each other. They know we are here, he added. They have not changed position or raised any defensive configuration since emergence. Note it, I said, file it. He went back to his console. I pulled the cultural database on humanity and read while the array processed. Standard practice, context before numbers, 400 years of spacefaring history, early and rapid colonial expansion across a wide band of this galactic arm, weapons development at a rate that several absorbed civilizations had independently flagged as alarming before the Dominion had absorbed them. a species that committed to problems with considerably more energy than the problems usually required. The database noted, as a cultural footnote, that humans named their ships, not operational designations, names, personal names with meaning and history attached to them, selected by the crews or the institutions that built them. Names that referred to concepts, to places, to people who had come before. More than that, when a human warship was destroyed, they rebuilt it under the same name, not a replacement vessel with a commemorative designation. The same designation, the same name, the same file continued, as if the destruction were a chapter rather than an ending. I read that section twice. The fleet's flagship registered in the partial records as CNS Unconquered, commissioned 312 years ago, under the command of a Captain Owen Hale, according to what remained of the original crew record. Multiple reconstruction events across its service history. 312 years, and the name unchanged across every version of the vessel, carried forward through every rebuild. I looked at that name for a long time. In Vreth tradition, ships receive operational designations, undying certainty, absolute measure, precise outcome. The name is a function expressed as language. It describes what the ship is designed to accomplish. The name is a contract with the intended result. Unconquered is not a contract. It is a record. A ship announcing, in the clearest possible language, what has not happened to it yet. I filed this under Cultural Data, subcategory, Naming Conventions. Then I returned to the hull integrity analysis because the tactical officers needed my report within the hour and the numbers were straightforward. The recommendation was going to write itself. 61 ships, ancient, undersized, outnumbered by a factor of nearly 7. The numbers were going to hold. They always held. In the maintenance log, the 0.3-second delay sat unreviewed, blinking quietly at the corner of my secondary screen. I did not look at it again. Not yet. The hull integrity analysis came back with anomalies in every single vessel in the human fleet. Not damage, I know the scan signature of battle damage. Impact craters, stress fractures, repair welds over structural weak points where weapons had struck, and the correction had not fully resolved the underlying deformation. Damage has a texture that the array reads clearly. What the scan was returning was not that. It was layers. Hull plate over hull plate over hull plate, each layer a different alloy composition, each composition manufactured in a different era. The array was reading the ship's histories the way you read geological strata, each layer representing not a year but a reconstruction, a decision to bring the vessel back from wherever it had gone and send it out again. I selected the first vessel for a detailed read, CNS Perseverance, length 800 meters, crew complement 2,200, hull age at base construction 140 years, but the layered data told a more complicated story. The base hull was 140 years old. The outer plating was 38 years old. The aft structural frame was 67 years old. The forward weapons hardpoints were 19 years old. The ship was not 140 years old. The ship was all of those ages at once. I ran the same analysis on the next vessel. Same pattern, the next, same pattern. I ran it on all 61 ships in the formation. Every single one. Not one vessel in the human fleet had a hull that was one age, one composition, one unbroken construction history. Every ship had been rebuilt, some of them several times. The fleet average, once I ran the full count, was 4 reconstruction events per vessel. I sat back in my chair. I am a professional. I do not sit back in my chair during an active analysis. I sat back and looked at the ceiling of the intelligence deck for approximately 4 seconds while my mind worked through what the data was telling me and attempted to find the framework where it belonged. I could not find the framework. Drenola watched me with the professional courtesy not to speak. In Dominion military doctrine, a vessel lost in combat is written off. The record is updated. A replacement is constructed to current specifications under a new designation. The replacement is a new ship. The previous vessel is a line in the historical record. There is no ambiguity. There is no question of whether the replacement is the same as the original. It is not. The new ship does not carry the history of the old one because the history of the old one is finished. You do not rebuild a ship that has been lost in combat. Not because you cannot, because the concept has no rational foundation. Why insist on the same hull, the same name, the same continuous record when you could build something better from the start? Why add a loss event to a file and then continue the file rather than opening a clean one? Unless the loss event in the record was the point. Unless you wanted anyone who looked at your fleet to see, immediately and without ambiguity, that these ships had been lost before and had been brought back regardless. I pulled the full record on CNS Unconquered. The record was incomplete in many places. 3 centuries of human bureaucracy left gaps that no database could fill, but what remained was more than enough. First commissioned 312 years ago, 8 years of service. First reconstruction event, return to service. 11 years of service. Second reconstruction event, return to service. The pattern continued across the centuries: service, loss, rebuilding, return. The records used a specific phrase each time: not recommissioned, not replaced, return to service, as if the ship had gone somewhere temporarily and come back. 11 reconstruction events in 312 years. The CNS Unconquered had been lost 11 times. In 11 separate engagements, over 3 centuries of continuous service, some critical part of this vessel had been removed from existence. And every single time, humans had gathered the pieces, gathered the resources, gathered whatever will was required, and rebuilt it, under the same name, with the same record attached. The destruction events listed in the file like any other entry, given no more and no less weight than the service years around them. 11 times destroyed. 11 times back. HFY, my tactical officer, entered the intelligence deck. He looked at my screen. He read the number beside the reconstruction count. I watched his expression do something it almost never did. "That is the flagship?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "The 11 represents?" "Yes, sir." He was quiet for a moment. "For the full fleet, the average is 4, I said. "Every vessel in the formation has been rebuilt at minimum once. Not one of them has an unbroken hull history." HFY stood still. He is not a man who stands still. He processes information quickly and acts on it quickly, and the space between those two things is very small. He stood still for a measurable length of time before he asked, "What is the tactical implication?" I looked at the 61 vessels on my display, each one a record of its own survival, each one built from the evidence of what it had already been through, the evidence pressed into the alloy of its own structure, layer over layer over layer. "I am still working through the implications," I said. In 19 years, I had never said that to a tactical officer. HFY left without another word. I returned to the data. The deep structure scan was still processing. While it ran, I noted an anomaly I had flagged during the hull integrity pass, a layer of non-metallic material detected on the inner surfaces of several vessels, deep within the hull structure, sheltered from open space by multiple layers of metal. Non-structural, not energized. The composition read as calcium carbonate. Stone. The texture analysis suggested carved stone. I flagged it for the interior scan and moved on to the biometric data. The tactical officers were waiting for my report. The analysis had to continue. I told myself the numbers would hold. I was running out of conviction, and repetition was filling the space where the conviction had been. The biometric scan covers everything a living body does. Heart rate, respiratory function, neurochemical output, hormonal profiles, cortisol levels, adrenaline levels, the complete chemical portrait of what a body is doing, and by extension, what state of mind it is in. Among its other functions, the scan produces a pre-combat psychological assessment. You look at tens of thousands of crew members, and you read, in their own biology, exactly how they are preparing for what is coming. In my experience, a crew facing a superior force in a high-threat engagement produces a predictable profile: elevated cortisol, elevated adrenaline, suppressed non-essential physiological functions as the body prioritizes threat response, neurochemical markers consistent with high alert readiness, the body converting itself into an instrument designed for a single dangerous purpose. I had read this profile many times. I knew it the way I knew my own voice. I began the biometric scan on the human fleet. The results came back in standard time, no delay. I pulled up the cortisol overlay first because cortisol is the baseline of any threat response assessment, the number that everything else is calibrated against. The human fleet's average cortisol level was nominal. I checked the calibration. The calibration was correct. I checked the species index. Confirmed human biological parameters. Confirmed correct baseline values applied. The scan was running on the right species with the right reference data, and the data was accurate. Nominal cortisol, more than nominal in specific sections of the fleet, below the resting average. I broke the scan down by station, by department, by position aboard each vessel. In the forward gun batteries of the CNS Unconquered, the crew members responsible for the weapons that would fire first and absorb the first return fire in any engagement. The cortisol levels were reading below the resting average. I ran that section of the scan again. Same result. I pulled the adrenaline profile, slightly elevated, not dramatically, not at the level I expected from a crew that had just entered a sector controlled by a force 7 times their number, a level consistent with mild physical activity, a brisk walk, a game of some kind. I ran the behavioral overlay. This cross-references the biometric data with pattern analysis, reading what the bodies are doing, what motions and activities are associated with the readings I was seeing. The forward gun battery crews of the CNS Unconquered. 14 crew members at the most dangerous stations on the most dangerous ship in a fleet that had no logical reason for being here. 3 of them were asleep. Not unwell, not sedated, asleep in the natural biological sense, slow heart rate, minimal motor activity, brain activity consistent with sleep, eyes closed. The behavioral analysis was confident in its classification. These were not people resting with one eye on the situation. These were people sleeping with every expectation that there was no reason not to. I did not check the calibration again. The calibration was correct. I knew the calibration was correct. I had already verified it, and re-verifying it would not change the number. I expanded the behavioral overlay to cover the full fleet. Across all 61 vessels, 46 crew members were engaged in non-operational social behavior, eating together in groups, conversing in numbers larger than any task required, playing games. The overlay flagged 6 separate instances of competitive games in non-duty areas. Crew members gathered around something and apparently absorbed in it. 17 crew members across the fleet were in individual rest. Then there was the music. The behavioral overlay flagged 49 crew members distributed across 9 different ships as engaged in coordinated sound production. The cultural database took approximately 3 seconds to process the audio signature and return a classification. Vocal and instrumental musical performance, communal, live. Not recorded music playing through a speaker system, live performance, with multiple people contributing to it together. 49 people, spread across 9 warships in a standoff, with the largest military formation in this sector, were singing. I sat with that data for a long time. I did not rerun the scan. I did not verify the audio classification. I was an analyst, and I recognized accurate data, and this data was accurate, and there was no instrument failure, and there was no calibration error, and 52,000 human crew members were doing this. They were calm. They were more than calm. I pulled up the psychological profile matrix. The VRETH standard uses a 12-point scale for pre-combat mental states, 1 through 4, controlled caution, functional, within expected parameters, 5 through 8, elevated aggression. Manageable, a standard response from a predatory species, 9 through 12, panic, instinct override, combat ineffective. I ran the human fleet's biometric data through the matrix. The matrix returned a classification I had never seen before. Not a number on the scale. A flag. The flag read, data outside classification parameters, suggested nearest analog, cross-referenced from cultural database, place state. I read the classification. I read it again. Play. The Matrix was telling me that 52,000 human crew members facing a superior force in contested space were neurochemically consistent with humans engaged in play, not rest, not suppressed fear, not controlled aggression. Play. Drenola had stopped pretending to look at his console. He was watching me directly. I was aware of this, and I did not address it because I did not have words for what I was looking at, and speaking imprecisely about data this significant was worse than not speaking at all. I opened my analysis notes. I typed a line, I deleted it. I typed it again, I deleted it again. On the CNS gray line, positioned at the left edge of the human formation, the passive audio array, still running as part of the behavioral scan, detected something. One person at an active crew station. The audio analysis ran its classification. Laughter. Genuine, not the kind of sound a person makes to ease tension, not the social reflex that people sometimes use when they are afraid and trying not to show it. The array is precise enough to tell the difference. This was the real thing, unguarded, unperformed. Someone on the CNS gray line, holding position across from 412 Dominion vessels, was genuinely amused by something. I closed the biometric file. The interior structural scan was next, and I was a professional, and the report was due, and I had work to do. I turned the volume on the passive audio overlay down, but I did not turn it off. The singing continued, very quiet, in the background of everything else I was doing. The deep structure interior scan takes longer than all the others. It reads past the outer hull, through the mechanical infrastructure, into the core of each vessel, looking for hidden weapon systems, secondary drives, shielded compartments, anything the ship might be carrying that its exterior profile does not reveal. Surprises. The last thing you want in a military engagement is a surprise you could have found in the pre-combat data if you had looked carefully enough. I ran the scan. The human fleet was carrying, for the most part, exactly what its exterior profile suggested. Weapons systems, engine assemblies, fuel cells, crew quarters, storage, the dense and complex infrastructure of 61 warships. Nothing hidden, nothing shielded. The tactical picture was consistent with what I had already assessed. Except for the anomaly. Every ship had it. I had flagged the material on 11 vessels during the hull integrity pass. The full interior scan confirmed it across all 61, non-metallic, non-energized, located deep inside each vessel's structure, sheltered from space by multiple layers of hull plating. The scan found it in the same relative position on each ship, not the same place on the exterior, but the same place in relation to the ship's interior layout, near the center, close to the structural core. Every ship had something non-metallic and non-functional at its center. I ran the texture analysis. Calcium carbonate, dense. The surface was not smooth. The scan resolved the surface pattern and the pattern was organized, regular, intentional. Text. Carved text, covering the surface of the material. The cultural linguistic database matched the character set to human standard script and processed the content. Names. Proper nouns, human names, thousands of them on each vessel, carved into the stone surface with tools, each character cut into the material by hand. On CNS Perseverance, the stone formed a single curved wall approximately 8 meters tall, running around the inside of the crew's central common area. On CNS Grey Line, 2 stone panels flanked the entry to the main operations deck. On the smaller vessels in the formation, carved panels were set into the walls of primary corridors. On the CNS Unconquered, the stone was 40 meters high. 40 meters, wrapped around the inner surface of the primary hull like a spine running through the entire length of the ship. The characters carved at the base were worn smooth, the edges rounded by long contact with hands that had passed over them. The characters near the top were sharp, recent, cut with precision that had not yet been softened by time or touch. I ran the name count on the Unconquered's wall. The scanner worked through it. The number came back. I read it. I read it again. I turned to Drenola. He had been watching me for some time. He looked at my screen and said quietly, "What is that?" "Names," I said. "Whose names?" I cross-referenced the carved names against the crew records in the cultural database. The database matched the naming conventions to a specific category: crew personnel, CNS unconquered, historical. The records were incomplete, as all the human records were, but the match was clear. Not the living crew. The names on the wall were not the people currently serving aboard the ship. They were every crew member of the CNS Unconquered who had entered this vessel's service and not returned from it. Every officer, every enlisted crew member, every person who had come aboard and been carried out on the ship's records under the notation the database classified as lost in service. 312 years of those notations. Every reconstruction event, every engagement, every version of the ship across 11 rebuildings, the names accumulating from the base of the wall upward across the centuries. The wall was their dead. All of them carried inside the hull, moved with the ship through every rebuild, every recommission, every time the vessel was sent back out. The list continuing from the bottom, new names added at the top, the wall growing upward year by year, engagement by engagement, the most recent additions still sharp-edged and waiting to be worn smooth by the same hands that had worn smooth the names below them. The ship carried its dead at its center. Not in a database, not in an archive, in stone, physical, present, real in the way that only material things are real. The CNS Unconquered had been built and rebuilt and built again, and through every version of itself, through every reconstruction, the wall had come with it, the one constant across 300 years of change. I ran the cross-reference on the full fleet. 61 ships. 61 walls of names. The scan returned the total count of carved names across all 61 vessels. I did not move for a long time after I read that number. Drenola asked me twice if I was still working. I heard him both times. I did not answer. In Vreth culture, the lost are accounted for. The record is updated. Their function is noted. Their replacement is allocated. The process continues because the process must continue, and halting it for any reason, grief, sentiment, obligation to the specific individual who had been in the role, serves no function and impedes the work. You do not carry the lost with you. You replace them and move forward, because forward is the only rational direction. The humans carried their dead into every engagement. Into this one. 61 ships, each one with its wall of names at its core, each one moving through space with the weight of everyone it had ever lost secured at the structural center of the vessel, not preserved in a distant memorial, not filed in a record and closed, present, on the ship, in the space where the crew walked and worked and slept and sang and played games while waiting for a battle. The new names at the top of the Unconquered's wall, the sharp ones, the recently carved ones, there were people currently serving on that ship who had walked past those names, who had touched them, whose hands had pressed against the carved letters of people who had served in this same hull, under this same name, in the same long story the ship had been telling for 3 centuries. The living crew walking past the names of everyone who had come before them in this exact place. 300 years of dead, carried forward into the next fight and the one after that. I opened my analysis file. I looked at the tactical implications section. I typed 2 words. It's a grudge. I looked at those words for a long time. Then I left them there and moved to the final stage of my analysis. The long-range sensor array was still running its passive tracking on the human fleet. They had not moved. They had not transmitted. 61 ships, ancient and rebuilt, and carrying their dead in their hearts. Waiting at the edge of Dominion space, in a loose formation that looked more like a gathering than a battle line. I went to prepare my report. The 0.3-second delay was still in the maintenance log. Unreviewed. Still blinking. Sorethvan receives report standing. This is a known preference. She believes that receiving information in a seated position creates a subconscious association between analysis and rest. She stands, and she expects the presenting analyst to stand, and she listens to everything before she speaks. In 20 years of filing reports to her, I had never seen her interrupt a briefing. She did not interrupt this one. I told her about the hull ages, the layered compositions, the reconstruction counts. I told her about the flagship that had been lost 11 times and returned 11 times under the same name across 312 years of continuous service. I told her about the biometric readings, the nominal cortisol, the sleeping gun crew, the 49 crew members singing across 9 ships. I told her about the psychological matrix returning a classification outside its scale and finding, in the cultural database, its nearest equivalent. I told her about the walls. I took my time with the walls, not because the data was complicated, the scan results were clear, but because I had a professional obligation to be precise, and I was not entirely certain I had processed what I was describing well enough to describe it accurately. 61 ships, 61 carved stone walls at the center of each vessel, every one carrying the names of every crew member who had ever served aboard and not come home, 300 years on the flagship. The recent names still sharp, waiting for the hands that would wear them smooth. Sorathvan listened to all of it without moving. When I finished, she stood quietly for a moment. Sorathvan processes before she responds. It is one of the qualities that makes her effective at her rank. Then she asked, "Do we engage?" I opened my mouth. The long-range sensor array chimed. Not a malfunction alert, not a calibration tone, the contact detection signal, the one the array makes when it finds something new. I looked at my secondary screen. One new contact, emerging from faster-than-light travel at the outer edge of the system, 300,000 kilometers from the human fleet's current position. Then another. Then 4 more, appearing in rapid sequence, the sensor display updating as each new contact resolved from the distortion of FTL emergence into a clear reading. Then 9 more. Then 3, almost simultaneously. 22 new human vessels had entered the system in less than 40 seconds, and the array was still resolving contacts that were still coming through. The new arrivals held the same profile as the original fleet, old hulls, layered compositions, reconstruction histories that the array read at a glance. These ships had the same story written in their structure that the first 61 carried. Sorathvan stood at the secondary screen beside me. Neither of us spoke. I ran the scan on the new arrivals, professional reflex. My hands moved before I had made a decision to move them. The scan was automatic, immediate, the practiced motion of 19 years. The result came back in 1.7 seconds. I looked at that number. 1.7 seconds. Standard correct, no anomaly. I thought about the original scan. 2 seconds, a delay of 0.3. I had entered it in the maintenance log as a calibration anomaly, a minor instrument irregularity, low priority, to be reviewed and corrected at the next standard maintenance interval. I had been certain it was a malfunction. I had been certain because in 19 years it had never happened before, and the only explanation that fit 19 years of experience was that something in the array had briefly misfired and corrected itself. The array had not misfired. I understood that now with a clarity that arrived all at once and was complete before I had finished understanding it. The scan signal, on its outbound pass toward the human fleet, had been intercepted. The human fleet had detected our scanning beam before it reached them. They had read it the way you read a message that was meant for someone else, and then they had passed it through their own scanning instruments on the way back, so that by the time the signal returned to our array, it carried data about them, yes, but it had also been handled, touched, read. They had scanned us. Before I had issued the scan order, before I had sat down at my station, before the low-priority alert had come through to the intelligence deck. The human fleet had arrived in this system, and the first thing they had done was look back at us. They had seen 412 Dominion vessels arranged in a combat formation. They had read our hull compositions, our weapons configurations, our crew complements, our power output levels. They had assessed us the way I was assessing them, and the 0.3-second delay in the return was the time their instruments had taken to complete that read. They had known what was in front of them since the moment they arrived. They had seen 412 Dominion vessels. And then the biometric scan showed they had sent 3 of their forward gunners to sleep and gathered 49 crew members to sing. Maury contacts on the display. The sensor array updated without pause, new arrivals continuing to emerge from FTL at the outer boundary in groups of 3 and 5 and 8. Each cluster resolved and held position, adding to the count, the formation that had been 61 vessels expanding in real time on my screen. HFY had entered the intelligence deck at some point. I had not heard him come in. He was standing at my left, reading the display, and his expression was the expression of someone who had been trained for 20 years not to show what he was feeling, and was now facing a situation that training had not covered. Drenola's hands were flat on his console. He was not working. He was watching the contact count climb. Sorathvan stood at the secondary screen. None of us spoke. I looked at the original 61, the Vanguard, the front of a fleet that was still coming through, still resolving, still adding to itself in the display, while the sensor array worked without pause to keep up with the arrivals. I thought about the word Vanguard, the front, the part that goes first, the part that absorbs contact before the rest comes through. 61 ships had looked at 412 Dominion vessels, understood exactly what they were looking at, and taken the vanguard position. They had volunteered to be the front. I thought about the walls of names, 40 meters in the unconquered, 300 years of crew members who had gone into the ship's service and not come back, carried forward in stone through every version of the vessel that had ever existed under that name. The recent names at the top, sharp and new. I thought about the crew members currently serving on these 61 ships, sleeping at their gun stations, singing together, playing games in the corridors behind them, looking at a Dominion fleet 7 times their size and neurochemically, biologically, chemically, being in the same state as when they were having a good time. They had done this before. Not this specific engagement, not this system, but this, whatever this was, the standing in the front, the waiting, the carrying of names forward, the rebuilding and the return and the going out again. They had been doing this for as long as their ships had been flying, and they had learned something from it that I did not have a category for and could not classify and could not file. They were not afraid. I did not mean the absence of caution. I did not mean recklessness or the kind of numbness that comes from being exposed to danger so long that it loses its texture. I meant something more specific and more unsettling than either of those things. I meant that somewhere in the accumulated history of what these people had done and survived and lost and rebuilt, they had arrived at a relationship with the possibility of loss that I could not locate anywhere in my database. The Dominion fights to win. These people fought with their dead already with them. The contact count climbed. I typed my formal recommendation into the analysis record. 2 words. I did not hesitate. There was nothing in me to produce hesitation. Whatever mechanism generates doubt had stopped functioning at some point in the last several hours, replaced by something simpler and more absolute. I typed the words the way you state a fact, the way you write a number that the data has returned and the calibration has confirmed and the second pass has agreed with. We leave. I did not look at Sorathvan. I did not need to look at her. She was reading the same display I was reading, and she was arriving at the same place I had arrived, and she would not countermand the recommendation because she was not a person who countermanded accurate assessments, and this assessment was accurate. I added 1 line to the additional notes section of my report. I had never used the additional notes section before. In 37 prior assessments, the data had been self-sufficient. The numbers had spoken clearly enough. I typed they scanned us before we scanned them. They arrived with full knowledge of this formation. The 0.3 second delay in the initial scan return was their instruments completing a read of our fleet. The 61 vessels are the forward element. We do not know the size of the full fleet. Based on the biometric data and the behavioral profile, this information did not change their pre-combat mental state. I paused. I looked at the display. The contacts were still coming. I typed the last line. They came anyway. I submitted the report. Sorathvan stood at the secondary screen. She read the recommendation. She read the additional notes. She stood there for a long time, reading, and the only sound in the intelligence deck was the soft, continuous tone of the sensor array updating its contact list. HFY said nothing. Drenola said nothing. The display updated. Updated again. The Unconquered was still in the forward position, the first ship you would reach if you crossed the distance between our formation and theirs, the ship that had been in that position for 3 centuries, under that name, carrying that wall. Someone somewhere in that formation was still singing. I had turned the volume on the passive audio overlay down, but I had not turned it off, and in the intelligence deck of the Undying Certainty, surrounded by the silence of 4 colleagues who were all reading the same display and understanding the same thing, I could still hear it, very faint, a human voice carrying across the dark between us, through sensors and processors and translation systems, arriving in the Dominion flagship as something the cultural database classified accurately and completely. A song. The display updated. None of us moved. The count climbed. There was no number coming that was going to change what the analysis had already established. There was no final count that was going to reframe the data or produce a different recommendation or return the situation to something that fit inside the framework I had spent 19 years building. The framework was not built for this. It had never needed to be built for this, because in 37 assessments across 41 civilizations, nothing had required it. Nothing had ever come back. Nothing had ever carried its dead to the front. Nothing had ever looked at the Dominion and found, in its own biology, the state that the cultural database described as play. The sensor array updated one more time. I looked at the new number. I closed the display. I sat with the report submitted and the recommendation filed and the numbers in the record, where numbers go when the analysis is complete and there is nothing left to do but act on what they say. The song continued, quiet, beneath everything. After a long while, Sorithvan turned away from the secondary screen. She walked to the door of the intelligence deck. She did not countermand the recommendation. She did not say anything. She just walked to the door and paused there for a moment and looked back at the display one final time. Then she began giving the orders that would turn 412 vessels around.